Open, please, to Deuteronomy chapter 1. Deuteronomy chapter 1. Webster says that a defining moment is the time that shows very clearly what something is really about. A time that shows very clearly what something is really about. I guess there are moments in history that help us to see what is truly important and who we truly are. Maybe most often these are experienced on an individual level. I think about high school graduates, the class of 2020, and what a strange senior year and graduation experience this is. I imagine the same is true. I mentioned high school, but also those who are graduating college during this time. And yet, for any period of graduation is sort of, turning over a new leaf. It's a stake in the ground, a time to say, wow, look at where I've come and look at what's ahead, a defining moment. Sometimes we experience defining moments on a local or state or even national level. I think about, natural disasters that can come through. Boy, haven't there been a lot of those in 2020, and how those were defining moments for people. It made us stop and evaluate, as it did. It made them stop and evaluate. What is life truly all about? What is most important? Of course, I don't have to remind you that what we're experiencing now is not merely local or even on a state or a national level, but a global pandemic. And how this has caused all of us to just stop and to reevaluate what is really important. In what ways is this moment defining us? Have we realized that maybe with a little less work, I don't know, has your work schedule, it seems that nobody's in the middle. It's either dramatically increased or dramatically decreased. I don't know where you are on that. But if you're in the work has dramatically decreased or life has come to kind of a screeching halt, maybe you realize, I don't really know what to do with myself without work. Work kind of was a definition of who I was, and now without it, I find that I'm kind of grappling with my identity. Maybe parents, this has redefined your appreciation for school teachers, okay? Being your child's teacher is something that maybe you were not on a full-time level like school teachers are used to doing. Have we picked up new hobbies? Have we finally gotten to those projects that we've been putting off for quite some time? And I'm interested in assessing that from this perspective as well. What about as a congregation? This is a defining moment for us. We haven't been able to be together since the first Sunday of March. It's been a long time. On the other side of this pandemic, and I don't know if it begins now or if it begins several months from now or even next year, this is one of those things that I imagine historians and others will be studying for quite a long time. I mean, once this popped up, we started talking about the so-called Spanish flu again, didn't we? And we began to analyze the things that they went through and what they did. And I imagine people will be talking about 2020 for a long time. Congregationally, will we be stronger or weaker as a result of us having passed through this period of time? Defining moments. For some of these questions and scenarios that I brought up, maybe we're already beginning to see the answers. But in other areas, the answers remain to be seen. What I want to do this morning is to go back to the Old Testament and to see a defining moment in Old Testament history. And then, of course, to make the modern applications and to ask us, how will this moment define us? Will it make us better, stronger, or will we decline and grow weaker? And of course, we're talking about it from a spiritual perspective. In the book of Deuteronomy, the children of Israel, let's talk about their defining moment for just a minute. The children of Israel were at a truly defining moment. These were God's covenant people. You go all the way back to the book of Exodus at the foot of Mount Sinai. And God is going to give this covenant to these people. But how little time it takes for them to break that covenant, for them to mess up and to go back on what they had committed with God that they would do. They were God's covenant people, but they had broken that covenant. And as a result of that, an entire generation was wiped out. There was an entire group of people who would be, I guess, the parents and the grandparents of the people to whom Moses is speaking in the book of Deuteronomy, that were no longer with them. And so in Deuteronomy, Moses is recalling what got them to the point where they are now. In fact, the word Deuteronomy means second law. If you're reading through the Old Testament, you'll hit Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and you'll realize when you get to Deuteronomy that there's some repetition there. And the reason is because these people needed to be reminded of what God had expected of them all along, and even of the mistakes that their ancestors had made, even their own parents and grandparents had made, their predecessors, prior to what got them to this point. What exactly was it that caused the children of Israel to get to such a low point that then resulted in Moses having to give them the law all over again? Well, we come to the book of Deuteronomy chapter 1, and we begin to see some of their sins listed. First of all, here was a people that chose fear over faith. Look at Deuteronomy 1, verses 19 to 25. I'll pick up in verse 21. Moses says, "See, the Lord your God has set the land before you," talking about the promised land. "Go up, take possession as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has told you. Do not fear or be dismayed." But Moses recalls, "All of you came near me and said, 'Let's send men before us.'" And then he talks about the 12 spies and how Moses permitted that to take place. There was one man from every tribe that was sent to the promised land to sort of spy things out. Come to verse 28 with me. "Now the people are asking, 'Where are we going up? Our brothers have made our hearts melt.'" Talking about the report of the 10 spies, saying, "The people are greater and taller than we are. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. And besides that, we've seen the sons of the Anakim there. And I said to you, do not be in dread or afraid of them. The Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight for you." But verse 32 says, "In spite of this word, you did not believe the Lord your God who went before you in the way to seek out a place for you to pitch your tents, in fire by night and the cloud by day, to show you by what way you should go." Here were a people who chose fear over faith. God had told them everything's going to be okay. God had told them, "I will go before you. I will ensure your success." And in spite of that, they instead chose to rely upon themselves, and it didn't work out well. Listen, I've got to stop and ask us, what will we choose? In this moment where we have more questions than answers, and even as a congregation, right? I'm sure that if we polled and surveyed one another, we'd find that maybe we're standing at different places on the scale of this coronavirus thing. I mean, there's no doubt that it's a real thing and that people have really died and suffered from it, and that it's having an effect on the general mentality of this country, not to mention the economic effects and other things. And I have to ask us, are we going to choose faith over fear? Will we rely on and trust in God in this moment? You know, Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, "God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." And then he proceeds then to say, "Don't be ashamed of the message. Don't be ashamed of the gospel, nor of me, the messenger of Christ." Here were a people in Moses' day that chose fear over faith. But in the second place, here's how they got there. Here's how an entire generation was annihilated and they were forced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. They chose grumbling over gratitude. They chose to complain and talk badly about one another, and specifically about their leaders. In verse 26 of Deuteronomy chapter 1, Moses says, "Yet you would not go up," that is, to take Canaan. "You rebelled against the command of the Lord your God, and you murmured in your tents and said, 'Because the Lord hated us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt to give us into the hand of the Amorites to destroy us.'" Can I point out that the murmuring began quietly below the surface in their tents? They didn't immediately go up and attack Moses and Aaron, although certainly it would rise and bubble to that head. But it begins on the inside, where a few of them are conversing together and they begin to speak negatively about what's going on. They're grumbling and complaining rather than focusing on the gratitude, on the blessings. And they have every reason to focus on God's blessings. But instead, they focused on grumbling rather than gratitude. And this morning, I just have to ask, this is a stake in the ground moment. A time to pause for just a minute and to assess where we've been and where we're going and how we're going to react in processing all of this. And we can choose to be negative and criticize every little thing that happens. Now, I'm just as capable of that as you are. Or we can come to the other side and we need to ask ourselves, will we choose gratitude over grumbling? You know, grumbling is not becoming of God's people. Philippians 2:14 and 15 says, do all things without grumbling or disputing. And then he says, the reason why we should do this is so that we may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Are we going to be different? Or are we just going to follow suit? Hebrews 13:17 gives us a little bit of a different twist on this. When the Hebrews writer there specifically talks about our leaders. And in the context, he's talking about the elders. Obey your leaders and submit to them, he says, for they're keeping watch over your souls. They have a spiritual obligation to us and to our souls as those who will give an account, that is, on the day of judgment. And then he goes on to say, let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. The point of the verse is, if we heap a burden so great upon our shepherds that they cannot serve with joy, but instead their service is a burden, then that's not going to benefit the rest of us as the flock, because our shepherds are going to be exhausted. The Hebrews writer says that's not what we want to do. This morning, will we choose gratitude over grumbling? The children of Israel wandered for 40 years because they chose fear instead of faith, because they chose grumbling instead of gratitude. And by the way, it shouldn't have taken them 40 years to get from Egypt to Canaan. God caused it to take that long, basically sending them around in a circle because of their faithlessness. Here's the third thing. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 41, Moses says they chose subversion over submission. That is, they rebelled. So in Deuteronomy 1:41, Moses says, you answered me. They feel contrition. We've sinned against the Lord. We ourselves will go up and fight, just as the Lord our God has commanded us. And every one of you fastened on his weapons of war and thought it was easy to go up into the hill country. Verse 42, but the Lord said, say to them, do not go up or fight, for I am not in your midst, lest you be defeated before your enemies. And Moses says, so I spoke to you, and you wouldn't listen. You rebelled. Subversion over submission. You rebelled against the command of the Lord and presumptuously went up into the hill country. And the Amorites who lived in that hill country came out against you and chased you like bees do and beat you down, it says. They weren't successful because God wasn't with them. God told them to rely on him, and they chose not to do it. This morning, we have to ask ourselves, in this moment, in this defining moment, will we choose to submit to God rather than rebelling, subverting what he would have us to do? Romans chapter 8, verse 7 says, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. I'm not going to submit to God's law if I'm constantly thinking about things from a worldly perspective. So that's not productive. If I'm thinking and focused on spiritual things, then the result will be I'll be willing to submit to God. Here's the fourth thing, going back to the Old Testament, this time pulling from the book of Numbers. They chose unrest over unity. They chose unrest over unity. Rather than seeking to compromise and to work together, they chose to rip the children of Israel, the Israelites, apart. Numbers 14, verse 4. This is after the 12 spies have gone and they've returned, and the bad report has been given, but Joshua and Caleb stand up on the other side and say, no, we can do this. We just need to rely on God. But Numbers 14:4 says, the people began to say to one another, let's choose a leader and go back to Egypt. The problem with this is God had chosen Moses. God had put Moses in charge. And so to rebel against Moses' leadership was to rebel against God's choice. And in so doing, rather than working toward unity, they chose unrest. Will we choose unity over unrest? Romans 14:19 says, let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. Easier said than done. Jesus says in Matthew 5, verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons or children of God. What's one of the defining marks of God's children? According to Jesus in Matthew 5:9, it's that they're peacemakers. They're not trying to rip things apart. They're trying to build up peace. And this begins, as Steve and I mentioned in our Wednesday Bible study from this past week, on an individual level. It begins with me realizing I need to make peace with you, one-on-one. When we have a rift or when something happens, we need to make peace with one another. We don't need to wait till it bubbles up to a congregational level and then begin to address it. So listen, here's the point. These are the four things that caused these people back in Moses' day to have lost an entire generation of those who had gone before them. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 30, and if you'll turn with me forward to Deuteronomy chapter 30 now, beginning at verse 11, Moses says this is a moment to stop, to kind of put a stake in the ground and to say, let's evaluate where we've been and where we're going. Now, Moses has been doing that throughout the book of Deuteronomy, but in verses 11 through 20 of Deuteronomy chapter 30, Moses has given them the law all over again, and he calls upon them to choose which direction they're going to go, to stop and appreciate that they're at a crossroads. They're at a moment of decision. What are they going to do with this moment? Look at Deuteronomy 30, verse 11, and read along with me, please. For this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It's not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. It's not beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart so that you can do it. See, I've set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, by keeping his commandments and its statutes and rules, then you'll live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you're entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away and you'll not hear, and you're drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you're going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, holding fast to him, for he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give to them. Moses reminded them in this text of three things. And I want to share them with you and then make an application, and then the lesson will be yours. First, Moses reminded them that they had everything they needed for success. God had not called them to something that was beyond them. He says in verse 11, this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you. That is to say, it's not humanly incomprehensible. You can get your mind around it. And then he says it's not far off. That is to say, it's not humanly inaccessible. You don't have to send some delegate up to heaven to try and apprehend the will of God and bring it back down. You know, the ancient little g gods, the idols of antiquity, were often like that. That their will, according to their religious adherents, was often obscure and vague. They didn't know what exactly to do in order to please their idol. But the God of heaven is not like that. He's revealed himself to us. He's spelled it out. This is exactly what you need to do in order to be obedient to me. They had what they needed for success. In fact, verse 14 of our text says, that word is near you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart. You can do it. You know what God expects of you. You've studied it, he was telling these Old Testament people. And the same could be true for you and me. They had what they needed for success. But in the second place, there were really only two choices. There was really only two options for what they could do. Verse 15, he says, I have set before you today, and then he gives us two pairs. Life and good on the one side, death and evil on the other side. The word evil literally means disaster or destruction. And so you've got life and goodness on the one hand, and you've got death and destruction on the other hand. And he proceeds to tell them that if you will obey God, then that means that you will love God. Or to state it differently, to love God is to obey him. Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. But on the opposite side of that, if you disobey God, that is equal to rejecting God. You see how there's no middle ground here. I either obey him or I don't. And in so doing, I'm either accepting him and growing in him and developing a relationship with him, or I'm rejecting him. I'm saying, you're not God. You don't have sovereign authority and power over me. And Moses reminds them of that here. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, by loving and walking in his ways and keeping his commandments, then you will live and multiply. Verse 17, but if your heart turns away, he says, you're drawn away to worship the other gods and serve them. And I declare you right now today that you shall surely perish. And then in the third place, Moses reminds them that they were to choose in that moment. This choice cannot be delayed. You got to choose now. Verses 19 and 20, he first of all calls heaven as a witness. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today. The witness aspect of this sort of gives a formality to this occasion. I'm calling as a witness. In other words, later, whatever happens, whatever the consequences are, good or bad, the people will not be able to blame their decision on someone else or on a circumstance, because Moses says, I'm calling all of creation, heaven and earth, to bear witness to this moment and to the choice that you make. And whatever the end result is, it's only because of the decisions that you made here and now and the subsequent ones after that. Your decisions are yours. And so he describes a witness, heaven and earth. And then he talks about the way. You know, there's only two choices, and so we would hope that at least one of those two would be clear, right? If God reveals to us the wrong way, at least in so doing, we know what not to do, and therefore we can do the opposite of that and be right. But God has really revealed both, hasn't he? He's shown us in so many ways what to do. And then he's come around and to complement that, shown us what not to do. He's given us the thou shalts, and he's also given us the thou shalt nots. And we're grateful for that. In fact, in this text, specifically in verses 19 and 20, Moses spends his time not on the negative, but on the positive. Choose life, the end of verse 19, that you and your offspring may live. And he proceeds with that in verse 20. And what he's doing is showing the surpassing worth of making the right decision. You'll be blessed if you do what's right. There's blessing that comes from that. So Moses sort of puts a pin in the timeline of the Israelites in Deuteronomy chapter 30. And he reminds them of these three things. You've got everything you need to be successful before God. There are really only two choices: life, good, or death and disaster or destruction. And he says, you need to choose right now. Now's the time to make your decision. What if this is our moment? What if this is our time to sort of put a stake in the ground and say, who will we be? How will we be known? What will define? And I'm not just talking about our society. You know, it seems our society is only getting more and more polarized as time goes on. Ironically, in a society that's filled with people who are outspoken in standing for what they believe is right, no one, it seems, knows how to engage a productive conversation with those on the opposite side. So instead of doing anything to draw us closer together, we just continue to get more and more apart. We're concerned for ourselves. I'm not trying to indict us. I'm just speaking of a society. We're concerned for ourselves and our points of view. And in the name of being right, we're willing to take down whoever we deem to be wrong. And as a result, we live in a culture that's divided, that's cynical, and that's just downright hateful to one another. But you don't need me to elaborate on the way the world works. I guess in a way it's always been this way, hasn't it? And Paul says to Timothy that the evil ways of men will just grow worse and worse. This is the way it's going to be. The question is not so much how the world is going to react, although we're praying that this can be a defining moment for our friends and neighbors. And perhaps there's someone watching us online today or that might not otherwise have been with us if we weren't streaming during these unusual times. This could be a defining moment for us all. The question is, will Christians follow suit with the world, or will we be different? Will we be like a city that's set on a hill that cannot be hidden, as Jesus says in Matthew 5:14-16? Will we be the light of the world and the salt of the earth to bring glory to our Father who is in heaven? How will this moment define us? You see, just like the children of Israel in Deuteronomy, we're at a crossroads, a moment of decision that'll shape the future. And just as Moses reminded those people back then, we can certainly remind us of the same three things. Number one, we have everything we need for success. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3, Peter says, His divine power, referring to God, has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. Do you want to know how to truly live life? Do you want to know how to be godly? Peter says God has given us everything we need, all things pertaining to life and godliness. All right, how? Through the knowledge of Him who called us to His own glory and excellence. The more I learn about God and about Jesus, the better I'm equipped for all things pertaining to life and godliness. So we have everything we need for success. In the second place, as Moses reminded the people in the Old Testament, let me remind all of us that there are really only two choices. You know, we like to pretend that it's okay to spend some time trying to find ourselves or trying to be sort of in this middle ground. But the Bible says there are two choices. Jesus says it in Matthew 7:13-14. Enter by the narrow gate, because the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter that way are many. But the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. You know, Jesus points out that if we love God, then we'll obey God. But if we disobey God, then we're the same as rejecting God. We're saying that I don't want to follow you. I don't want to do what you say. He says in Matthew 7:21, not everybody that says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And he talks about the judgment day. He says, many folks will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And cast out demons in your name, and do many wonderful or mighty works in your name? And he says, I'll declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. This isn't one of those passages that we delight to preach about or to read. I don't believe this is a passage that the Lord delights to say, that the majority of the people who even claim to know Jesus will actually, as it turns out, won't. But this is the reality. And so there are really only two choices. And as Moses reminded the people in the Old Testament, may I also remind us that the New Testament teaches that today is the time to choose. 2 Corinthians 6:2, now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. Romans 13:11, besides this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. Today is the time to choose. This morning, boy, I'm so glad to see you. I'm so glad to know that there are literally over 100 folks, around 150 last time I looked, that are watching on the live stream right now. I need to ask all of us a question. Will I use this moment for good and for life, or for evil and for death? How are we going to use this moment? Will we choose faith or fear? Will we express gratitude or grumbling? Will we seek to submit to God or to subvert the authority of God? Will we choose unrest or unity? You see, the reality is all of creation will witness the choice that we make. And they will witness or attest to the fact that this choice is entirely ours. Whatever the consequences, good or bad, they will be a direct result of what we chose. Let's choose to see the blessing of the coronavirus, acknowledging the pain that so many are feeling as a result of friends and family who have struggled or even have died because of this virus. Let's use this as an opportunity to put a stake in the ground and say, this is a moment that could define us as God's people and could help us to be stronger and closer to Him. And perhaps for someone who is here today or watching us today, maybe this moment, this very moment, maybe this is your defining moment. Maybe this is the moment that you decide to dedicate your life to the Lord by submitting to Him in obedience to the gospel. Maybe this is the moment that you rededicate your life as a Christian by confessing sin or repenting of sin. Maybe this is your moment. And if that's the case, we have an opportunity now to assess ourselves and to respond with commitment to the Lord. Connor has an invitation song prepared for us. We're going to consider the gentle voice of Jesus that hearkens to us to respond to Him in obedience. And if there's someone here who needs to respond, we pray that you will. If there's someone online this morning that needs to respond, call us at that number we've been giving out, 803-526-7478, and let us know how we can assist you with a spiritual need. If someone here needs to come, please do so now while we stand and sing.